Hello, everyone, and thanks for tuning in to my talk today about remote work. So our relationship to remote work has changed quite a lot in these last few years, hasn't it? It's gone from just some hipster companies doing it to then practically saving our society during the pandemic. And now we seem to be in the process of negotiating a new equilibrium. And I think that in this process, the concept of remote work has become really loaded with different meanings. It may be understood as just working from home, but then what about companies with cross-office collaboration? Should we view that in the same way? Does remote mean we work together less, or does it mean that we work less altogether? Is it about employees taking back power from companies? So in my talk, I want to dig a bit deeper. First, I'm going to debunk some common objections that come up about remote work. And then I'm going to explore the best practices about organizing software teams, regardless of location, with a particular focus on using digital tools. So when it's all said and done, I hope to leave you with a more nuanced way to think about remote work. And just a quick note about terminology. I will use remote work and distributed teams somewhat interchangeably, although I do find the distinction between those two terms useful, because the first one I use as a generic term describing just not working at an office, while distributed ways of working or distributed teams describe working arrangements that are more deliberately designed to work from multiple locations. So let's take a look at the common objections to remote work. And let's introduce a fictitious character here called Joan, the manager. And Joan is a very good person and trusted employee who's always focused on doing what is best for the company and her colleagues. Although she is a bit old school. She's trying to figure out this new trend of remote work and make it work for the company, but she has concerns. And her top concern is that productivity will suffer. So this is the big one, right? And there's plenty of ink spilled on the topic. So let's go ahead and unpack it a bit. And let me show my cards right from the start. I don't buy this simplistic logic, because as far as I know, there is no evidence for it, as research that is coming out about the topic is inconclusive at best. Here's the example of HubSpot. They did a study and found no difference in productivity between the remote people or people in the office. And in fact, I doubt we could even rely on academic social research to come up with clear guidance here, because productivity is such a complex topic anyway. So the key point I would say to Joan is, how sure are you that collaboration that is happening in person is actually enabling productivity? And furthermore, how are you even measuring productivity? If it's about counting things such as lines of code or emails or time to respond to chat messages, you're probably on the wrong track. Number two, everyone won't be able to get along. Yeah, it is hard to deny that in general, it's nicer and easier to relate to someone in person, but that is not all there is to it. So I would just tell Joan that people have no problem with building deep connections just by communicating on video calls and using digital tools. I have personal experience to that effect, and where I had worked with someone for months before ever meeting them in person. And it was great to do that, but the relationship did not really feel meaningfully different after we had met. Next one, being remote is hard on my employees. So we have Joan showing her empathetic side. And yeah, it's always valid to be concerned about employees' well-being, and working remotely does have its share of challenges. And this is especially true for people who are working from home all the time and may not have family connections there. But employees have a few options to explore to offset the negative aspects of working from home, such as occasionally visiting local co-working spaces, or even just going to a coffee shop sometimes. But there is a role for Joan to play as a representative of the organization by being proactive and empathetic towards her employees. And I think that even small gestures, if they're genuine, go a long way here. And then for number 4, we have Joan showing her controlling side. Well, there is a solution for Joan here, and there are these productivity monitoring software that let you spy on what people are doing at their computers. Of course, as a result, Joan may end up breaking down the trust that exists between the employees and therefore destroy what is otherwise a practically universal desire to be creative in one's work and proactive in solving challenges that are appropriately sized. So Joan, don't do that. There's very little you can do in a modern workplace by exercising control. That era is simply over. Nowadays, we know that successful organizations capitalize on people's intrinsic motivation to be creative and fulfill their work, and physical oversight is not a requirement to do that. And lastly, what about the culture? Well, first, some news for Joan. Culture is much more than what you can influence. I really like this expansive definition of what culture really means by John Cutler. You can see it on the right-hand side, or if it's difficult to read, you can Google it. But to summarize, culture is not something that gets mandated from above and then controlled. Instead, it's everywhere in the environment. It gets absorbed and then co-created by the employees as they are doing the work. It is their interactions, expectations, decisions, and behavior, and those are happening online or offline. And a mandate to return to the office is a part of the culture, but it will not solve all issues related to building good culture, and in fact, it will probably cause a lot of new ones. Okay, so let's leave Joan to think about this in peace while we pull back and instead talk about what makes teams work well, whether they're co-located or not. I think this is condensed well into these three pillars. So we have trust in each other and the broader organization. Secondly, knowing what the team's mission is and believing in it. And then thirdly, having the right mix of skills and continuously developing them. All three pillars are what make up the experience that each employee has. And that is, in turn, what makes the culture. So let's take a look at each one of them and think about how physical co-location affects it. So talking about trust. Trust is a word that has several aspects to it. One component is being dependable, so doing what we said we do. And I think this one is particularly important in the top-down direction, so from management downward. Perhaps the more important one, though, in the context of a team, is the ability to be vulnerable with one another, specifically by having the courage to express thoughts and opinions that may be difficult for others to hear. And why is this important? Because it is only through learning to resolve differences or conflicts in a productive way that the team can really work together. And then on the side of the recipients, the principles to follow are to assume good faith and to keep what happens within the team confidential, within reasonable limits, of course. But the bottom line for our discussion is this: there is nothing about virtual interactions that make that dynamic any different than in person. Same principles need to be observed. Next, knowing the mission. And it is this aspect that most shows the quality of the top-level leadership within a company. Because communicating a clear business and product strategy is not a simple task, but it is what it takes to truly allow the teams themselves to understand their place within the broader system and find the best solution to the challenges that they are supposed to tackle. So if you want to have empowered product teams in Marty Kagan's sense, then teams need to know the answer to the following question: what is the overall strategy? How do we fit into it? What should we be doing to contribute to companies' goals? What is it that we can decide on our own, and what shouldn't we? And why is our work ultimately important? So to achieve the clarity of communication that is required to align a whole organization around knowing these answers, you need to rely on every medium of communication at your disposal, whether it's real-time addresses or written documents, collaboration platforms, etc. And it definitely goes beyond saying that no company would rely solely on in-person spoken communication to achieve this. So being distributed is not the big hurdle here. The hard work is actually crafting and then sharing all of this important context. And then lastly, being good at what you do. So here I'm going to introduce the concept of team cognitive load, which was defined by psychologist John Sweller as the total amount of mental effort being used in working memory. Although in our context, that would be better described as ensuring that the team has enough people with enough diverse skills to be able to support and improve the part of the system that they are charged with in an efficient manner. And additionally, there would be just enough challenges in their work to enable further learning without unsustainably increasing their cognitive load. So in software development, there's a lot of complex factors that affect the team's cognitive load. The most important ones being the organizational structure and its interaction with the software architecture. And the team topologies framework is a good resource if you want to dig deeper into this subject. But my only point for now is that this aspect of the employee experience needs to be managed to the best of the organization's ability. However, the teams themselves can also do a lot to make the cognitive load more bearable, and that is by sharing and managing their knowledge. So it's not enough to just rely on your individual working memory. We need to be writing things down. Documentation, notes, chat conversations, diagrams, references to online resources. All of these are essential for maintaining and growing knowledge at the individual as well as the team level. And physical presence is not a requirement here. The only possible exception is synchronous collaboration, so sharing knowledge together. That is perhaps more natural to do in person, but digital tools can replicate that experience very well. And so you may notice there has been a common thread behind everything I've talked about, and that is digital tools. They are a foundation of modern work. So let's highlight a few categories that are most important. So first we have maybe the most common functionality, synchronous communication, or put simply, talking. Everyone has broadband internet these days, so video chats have become fairly frictionless, so much that in fact they sometimes get overused, which we've come to know as Zoom fatigue. I believe the phenomenon of all-day Zoom meetings is connected to a misunderstanding of how to use it. It's just not a good idea to put every meeting or every interaction and make that a Zoom call. But that said, video calls are a cornerstone of working in a distributed team. The next category that I think is really important is visual real-time collaboration. So what I'm talking about here is tools like Miro or FigJam and others that have really come into their own during the pandemic. When used to collaborate in a group setting, they can replicate the experience of sitting or standing together in front of a whiteboard very well, and perhaps even better, because you have affordances like the infinite canvas, ability to move focus together, and zoom in on different sections. And so in my opinion, these tools have become indispensable even for co-located teams. So the third area I want to focus on is engineering, because engineering has had collaborative sharing built in practically from the start, or at least in the last few decades. And those collaboration practices are needed in the same extent in co-located settings. I'm referring here specifically to code management in code repositories, using most likely Git, which is the de facto standard nowadays. If you want to do mob programming, and I think, by the way, that you should, you can easily do so in remote setting as well. There are great tools to enable that. And lastly, we have asynchronous communication, which actually can be understood also as knowledge management. I think that this portion is actually the most underused aspect of using digital tools, because the major advantage of asynchronous communication is that it allows for some breathing room for the author to craft their message. So traditionally, we understand that as creating documents, memos, presentations, focusing on that, like one piece of deliverable, and really working on it until it's perfect. And that is fine and sometimes necessary, but I'm a big believer of the potential of that in-between space. So what I'm talking about here is normalizing the practice of expressing small and contained ideas that are just too big to share in real-time conversation, but shouldn't require high-quality standards. This is similar to what the author Anne Lamott calls shitty first draft. So let's share those shitty first drafts. And I would go so far as to say that having a culture where ideas only get shared in these two extreme forms is actually not teamwork friendly. Because on the first end of the spectrum, you prioritize quick and simplistic thinking, so in conversation. And on the second, there is a danger of investing a lot of effort on something that ends up being such a completed piece of work that is difficult to improve upon it. So it doesn't get a lot of engagement. And I know I can recognize that I've been guilty of that sometimes. So the key component to enabling that middle ground is a high amount of trust and psychological safety within the team. Because it's basically that I'm showing you my incomplete thought, and it may turn into something or it may not, but please don't mock me. And there are, of course, a lot of ways to create this. Throwaway documents, presentations, chat messages, Slack posts are, I think, very much geared towards that. And there are tools like Loom. I don't know if you know that tool. It's really interesting because it allows you to quickly record yourself and your screen and then share that video in a way that allows for easy engagement with it. But I think an interesting reflection is that in-person interactions are not really naturally very geared towards expressing these kinds of non-completed ideas. We're not that, we don't really have conventions around that. So I think that digital tools are more natural fit for that. And then the second and just as important aspect of asynchronous communication is what I'd call very asynchronous communication. So creating content that may be consumed months or years later. And a less pretentious way to describe that would be documentation. I'm not going to go too deep on that, other than to suggest just sticking to these principles. Automate the documentation creation if you can. So if it's related to any code artifacts, that's really great to do. Write down the minimum amount of the high-level information, but keep that updated. So I'm talking here about product or project goals, vision, ways of working, developer instructions, things like that. And then thirdly, adopt the habit of, when appropriate, promoting information that gets shared as part of everyday work into documentation artifacts. For example, pinned Slack messages, decisions that are taken, summaries of post-mortem meetings, and even commit messages should actually be part of the team's documentation. And lastly, let's get slightly futuristic, although after observing what's been happening with AI the last few months, it seems that it's better to say that being futuristic is just being pragmatic. Our digital tools are being rapidly augmented with AI functionality and making them even more powerful. For example, Microsoft Teams will soon be able to have automatic summarizations of meetings and generate action points from them, which is, of course, impossible if the meeting is in person. And another potential sea change that can happen in this space is the metaverse, which may be just around the corner. We'll see how that pans out, but it should create even better approximations of physical presence. So we haven't really talked about being remote or co-located in the last few minutes, have we? And that is somewhat intentional because it's, in my opinion, not really the important thing. So instead of can we do remote or not, we should be asking questions like these. Do our employees trust each other and the broader organization? Have we shared our vision and mission and goals clearly? Do the employees believe in it? And are they allowed to make decisions to fulfill it? Then do our teams have the right mix of skills? Is their cognitive load manageable? Are they growing? And then when it comes to digital tools, are we using them in a good way? How else can we use them to support our employees in making their experience as good as it can be? And once you've done that, the location of where people do the work should actually become just an afterthought. So that's what I had to say here. I'm really looking forward if you have any questions around the topic, and I will be, so I'll ask Alan to help out in this section.
Thank you, Marko. We do have 2 questions here. So I'll just get started with that. And if anybody else has a question, just click raise your hand and we'll go straight to you. So the first one we got, Marko, is can you highlight some of the risks of not allowing employees to work remotely at all?
Yes, sure. Well, I mean, the obvious one would be employee retention or attracting new talent. So that kind of goes back to what I was saying in the beginning about there being this like new equilibrium that's being negotiated, and of course it's, you know, the interests of the two parties can sometimes be in, so employers and employees can sometimes be in conflict there, and we'll see where the equilibrium lies. But you want to have access to the best people possible. But the second one, the second aspect that I would say is that there might be less of an incentive to use digital tools properly if you're having mixed messages about like physical presence. So what would make sense to me as the best approach would be to really like double down or examine or get better at using digital tools, and, you know, see how that then affects your thinking about remote work. That's what I would advise to Joan or any other CEO if they ask me.
Thank you. So the second question that came in, I think you touched on a bit, so it would be great to hear an expansion if you have additional thoughts. And it's, do managers need to learn new skills to effectively manage distributed teams?
Yeah, it's a lovely question. Well, I think that it's there are two trends that have been going on here. One is about like the remote work, but the second is also about I guess you could call it empowerment at the lower level. So making sure that you leading less by control and instead by providing context. And managers that want to do well in the modern world do need to change those skills, to change any skills that are related to allowing for that, you know, releasing control in some way. I guess it could be put like that. And whether that maps to remote, again, I don't think it's not because of remote. It's because that you know, we've realized that creativity is probably more important than, you know, being able to strictly follow instructions or craft instructions. So yeah, as long as you're you know, have that mentality that you don't lead by control, I think you do fine in remote settings too.
Okay, great. We also got a question in the chat just now from Carl that I'll read aloud for everyone. Any reflections on conflict management and remote working? Is it harder to pick up on team members being dissatisfied when working remotely?
I don't know. I mean, that would be a really you know, difficult to be certain for sure. My feeling is that as people a lot of times get like overestimate how much of these kinds of signals can be picked up in person versus remotely. For sure, you do need to have you do need to have, like, you know, contacts regularly with people to be able to pick up on that. But I'm not sure how well that translates in in-person environments as well. Maybe people who are more, you know, restrained in showing their emotion, you might not be able to pick that up either. So yeah, I don't know. I would say that what you want to do as a company is to work hard on enabling those positive interactions to happen. So that's the active approach. You want to make sure that this collaboration is happening, that people are expressing their thought, that people are tuning in to whatever sessions you have, and then observe what happens then. If you're just concerned about like catching people when they are showing this kind of a dissatisfaction, or they're being harmed by any conflict, that may be too late anyway. So yeah, I'd say it's better to focus on that and really like change the context of this, like, because ultimately this is about like well-being, but you don't ensure well-being by spotting when people are already so far that they are already dissatisfied. But yeah, I could imagine that somebody who wants to disconnect, maybe it may be easier for them to do it in a remote setting. But you may have already lost a lot of the battle if people are already inclined to just disconnect or not engage in constructive conflict resolution.
Thanks everyone for joining today, and thank you, Marko. Appreciate it. Have a lovely
Thank you all for
afternoon.
tuning in.
Bye.
Have a lovely lunch hour.